This episode is scripted, narrated, recorded and edited by Newell Fisher. Hello and welcome to the Watership Down podcast episode 55, in which we will be looking at the role of does or female rabbits in the 1972 novel. Last week's episode, by sheer chance, was released on International Women's Day, so this seems appropriate. Does in Watership Down. It has been said that the novel Watership Down is very male-centric. While there are arguably reasons for that, in particular the inspiration of the author Richard Adams' military experience in the novel, these days this can stick out a bit. While does become more involved in the narrative in the latter part of the novel, mainly due to becoming the main driver of the plot, every portrayal of Watership Down on film has felt it necessary to either introduce new female characters or to feminise existing male characters, while the sequel, Tales from Watership Down, published in 1996, introduced new female characters and arguably extended their role in the narrative. It is a convention in the novel that does' names are rendered in the original Lapine, with the exception of the hutch-does, while the names of bucks are usually translated into English, with the Lapine being used occasionally, for example while Bigwig is undercover in Efrafa. I haven't looked into whether bucks' names are further translated into the relevant language in translated editions. I would guess they are. As a result, the wonderful names of does in the book are a main source of new words in Lapine. So let us name the does of Watership Down in order of appearance, with translations where these are given or relevant. Nildro-hain, Song of the Blackbird. Clover, a hutch-doe, the first doe to speak directly in the book. Haystack, a hutch-doe. Hyzenthlay, fur shining like dew. Thethuthinang, movement of leaves. Nelthilta, Thhrayonlosa. Vilthuril. It's a real shame that not all of these are translated. There is a test that feminists apply to works of fiction to determine whether or not they represent women, or does, fairly. It is called the Bechdel test. In order to pass this test, the work in question must feature a conversation between two women in which the topic of the conversation is not a man. There is a stricter version of this in which both characters must be named. How close does Watership Down come to passing this test? Well, from what I can see, there is one scene that comes close. It occurs in chapter 35, Groping, on page 325 in my 1978 Penguin edition. It is the scene in Efrafa where Bigwig comes across Hyzenthlay reciting a sad poem to other does, two of whom, at least, Thethuthinang and Nelthilta, are named characters in the book. However, the poem makes a brief reference to choosing a mate, and none of the other does present say anything until Bigwig makes himself known. So, overall, regrettably, the book does not pass. But this isn't really a surprise. So, where do we go from here? The answer is really quite simple. I'm going to summarise the plot of the novel from a purely female perspective. It's an interesting exercise in which the main male characters are mere characters in common in a disjointed narrative that seems more like the story we're familiar with, the further it progresses. Watership Down, the doe's tale. In Adbury Park Warren, Nildro-hain, along with her mate, meets the leader of a group of buck Hlessil. After he is given a tour of the warren, she asks if he has been as far as the well pit and has seen the artistic shapes that are a unique feature of this warren. The next day, she dies in a snare. A few days later, we learn of the gassing of the warren at Sandalford, during which does detected the gas first and tried to escape, though those with litters would not leave them and attacked anyone who came near them. No does survived. A few days later, the hutch-does Clover and Haystack and their mates are visited by two bucks at Nuthanger Farm at the foot of Watership Down. The larger of the two bucks makes it clear they would like to rescue them all and take them back to their warren. Clover is excited by the prospect of such freedom. The two bucks leave when one of the farm cats shows up. Meanwhile, at the warren of Efrafa near Overton, Hyzenthlay meets a buck who has attempted to act as an emissary from another warren, only to be told he cannot leave. She tells him about Efrafa and about how a group of them have tried to ask to leave due to overcrowding, only to be refused. The system there is breaking down, and many does would happily go elsewhere. 3 nights later, several bucks return to Nuthanger Farm. It is clear that the larger buck who visited before is their leader. They free the hutch-rabbits, and Clover leaves the hutch first, pushing at the breached hutch door in order to get out. Once in the farmyard, one of the farm cats begins to circle them, wary as it has been attacked by a large buck. Then the farm dog wakes up. Clover and her mate run with their rescuers, however Haystack and hers are too afraid to move. The leader of the bucks comes back and tries to persuade them to get going. The arrival of a hrududu persuades Haystack to move, but her mate has to be left behind. Haystack only just gets away with one of the bucks, but their leader is shot. The 2 hutch-does, Clover and Haystack, start their new life in the wild on Watership Down in a very subdued atmosphere. The chief is probably dead, and later that day a group of bucks arrive back from an expedition in an awful state. In a large burrow called the Honeycomb, the leader of the expedition tries to reassure Clover, Haystack and the hutch-buck about life in the wild before giving a full account of the expedition to all the rabbits of the warren. Clover and Haystack learn about it being an attempt to persuade does from a large warren called Efrafa to come and join the warren on Watership Down. They also learn about the terrifying nature of Efrafa and how awful life is for does there, where they have to spend most of their lives underground. The only way to obtain a bit more freedom is to join the Owlsa, but no doe can do so. There are more does than bucks, and they are not allowed to dig without permission from the all-male leadership of Efrafa. As a result, many of them have become unable to produce litters. After giving his account of the expedition, the leader of it goes above ground with Clover to Silflay. She is adapting to warren life better than the others. Then a buck arrives with the good news that the chief is alive but wounded. The chief returns to Watership Down a few days later, and after meeting Clover and Haystack again, he outlines his plan to rescue does from Efrafa in the Honeycomb, though the details are going to be a closely guarded secret. Incredibly, it seems a seagull is helping them. There is a lot of excitement about the plan among the bucks. The next day, all the bucks, bar 4 of them, leave Watership Down, headed for Efrafa. A few days later, in Efrafa, the young doe Nelthilta, on the way out to Silflay, speaks to her mark captain, making a veiled reference to an Owlsa officer who was killed by a fox on wide patrol a couple of days earlier. She asks if some does could be allowed to go on wide patrol, knowing it will never happen. Hyzenthlay meets with Thethuthinang, Nelthilta and another doe during Silflay. Her and Thethuthinang had been in the group of does in the near 4 mark who asked to leave Efrafa. The does who asked to leave have been broken up into different marks. They are all feeling despair at their situation, and Hyzenthlay recites a poem that reflects this. They are interrupted by a large buck with a strange fur cap on his head. He is an Owlsa officer, and they are very wary of his attempts to make conversation. They give their names when asked, except for one after Nelthilta interrupts to sarcastically make her contempt for him clear with mock politeness. Strangely, he seems to know something about Hyzenthlay, who has never met him before. A little later, a young buck tells Hyzenthlay she is to go to the large buck's burrow. This can only be for one reason, and she arrives very tense, trying to make it clear that it is not her time for mating. Incredibly, the buck tells her his real reason for being in Efrafa. He knows the bucks who escaped a few days earlier, and is there to help those to escape. He tells her the whole story of how his group left their previous warren before it was destroyed, and founded a new one a couple of days' journey away. Most of that new warren are now hiding out near Efrafa, waiting for him to get as many does out as he can, and they have a bird who can pass messages back and forth to help with the plan. Hyzenthlay has powers that enable her to see the future sometimes, like a buck in his group who saw their warren would be destroyed. She has a vision of the future, of fear and men, of a dog, a snapping rope, and of a rabbit riding in a hrududu. She is confused by all this, but now knows she can trust this buck. This begins the part of the story during which the does are the most actively involved in the plot. Hyzenthlay gives the buck a detailed account of the events surrounding their request to leave Efrafa in relation to when his fellow bucks arrived as emissaries and later escaped, as well as the treatment of an efrafan buck who encouraged them and later tried to escape himself. She makes it clear that Nelthilta was not part of the group who asked to leave and is too young and impulsive. He asks her to pick the does who will escape herself. She replies that they must only know about the escape for as short a time as possible beforehand to prevent news getting out. He has also decided that the buck who encouraged them must be rescued as well. He adds that the bird who is passing messages will help them in the escape, and that they will use a trick to get away. Hyzenthlay points out that the escape will need to happen during the next 2 days if it is to happen at sunset. Although she is apprehensive about what could go wrong, Hyzenthlay is excited by the prospect of a free life on Watership Down, and the buck is clearly glad he met her. She has made his job a lot easier. The next day, thunder is approaching. During morning Silflay, the buck meets Hyzenthlay and Thethuthinang in the same hollow where they first met. They are both nervous. He tells them to gather the does for an escape that evening. Thethuthinang wants reassurance that the bird will really help them escape. She also wants to know the direction they should run in. He points out the railway arch in the distance. Lastly, she points out the probability that they will meet the greatest patroller in Efrafa. He assures her they can handle him. He tells them to sharpen their claws. They will need them. However, that evening the escape does not go ahead. Later, a scared Hyzenthlay meets with the buck and asks if just her and Thethuthinang could get away with him. They told the other does about the escape just before it was due to happen, and she is now nervous about the Council of Efrafa finding out about it. Thethuthinang is watching them and trying not to sleep in order to do so. He tells her that they need to hold their nerve and promises they'll be out of Efrafa by that time the next day. At morning Silflay, Nelthilta is unable to resist making unwise remarks to the mark captain, and the buck has to distract him. The thunder is getting closer. Later, Nelthilta is arrested. Hyzenthlay wakes the buck up to warn him, and he tells her to gather the does immediately. She gathers them quickly. They are terrified. He tells them to keep one of the Owlsa officers talking, if necessary, when he comes up for Silflay with the buck who is coming with them. Shortly afterwards they will hear fighting. That will be their cue to run. Shortly afterwards they hear the fighting, and the escape begins. The thunder is breaking, and it isn't long before they hear the sounds of the alarm being raised. Meanwhile, Nelthilta is being questioned while being beaten by the head of the dreaded council police, the Owlsa. She is telling the chief everything when the news arrives that the escape has begun. Nelthilta hears the dreaded chief swear that he will blind the buck who has led the escape. The escaping does have reached the railway arch and are told that the bird will help them soon. They continue on when the dreaded patrolling Owlsa officer turns up. The buck talks with him angrily, and then Thethuthinang sees the chief approaching from the railway arch. All seems lost. The buck curses the chief. At that moment there is a crack of thunder and lightning, and the promised bird attacks. The does, terrified and confused as the rain falls, are guided by friends of the buck to a river. None of them have seen one before. They are told to go on to a wooden object at the edge of the river. Hyzenthlay is already on it, but the others are waiting to be told what to do by the buck. Another buck is holding a rope in his mouth for some reason. The buck tells Thethuthinang this is the promised trick. One doe panics when she sees a patrol approach and bolts, running straight into the chief of Efrafa, who rakes her across the face with his claws. She then runs straight onto the wooden object in her panic. Every doe follows her. The chief issues dreadful threats as the bird is no longer around. Suddenly the buck shouts that he can see it, and suddenly, miraculously, the chief is gone. How this has happened exactly is unclear. However, there is water on the floor of whatever they are on, which the efrafans try to get out of by staying at either end, with only Thethuthinang sharing a raised area with a buck in the centre. The bucks seem very pleased with themselves overall. Then Hyzenthlay sees the white bird approaching and reports this to the officer who seems to be in charge, the one who held the rope in his mouth earlier. After a hurried conversation with the bird, the officer tells them all to get into the bottom of the wooden object quickly, despite the water. There is a dreadful scraping sound and sudden darkness, and Thrayonlosa is struck hard in the back. Then it is light again. Hyzenthlay comforts her. Then, some time later, after more urgent conversations with the bird, there is a jolt. More urgent conversations follow. Suddenly, one of the efrafans hears humans. She stamps an alarm in the water-covered floor, and they all freeze. Hyzenthlay meets the eyes of the officer. He looks scared, but is not moving. And then the humans are gone. More conversations, and then the officer and 2 more bucks, and one, the efrafan, are gone. A short time later they appear on the ground nearby. Hyzenthlay and the other efrafans are told by the buck who got them out of Efrafa to jump off the wooden object and swim one by one. Still terrified and confused, they obey this order, all finding themselves in a tunnel filled with water, before ending up back on land somehow. The injured Thryonlosa is helped by Thethuthinang and a buck. The rabbits all crawl into undergrowth, exhausted, and sleep. During the night, Thryonlosa feels worse due to her injuries and crawls away from the sleeping Thethuthinang to a clump of reeds, where she dies. The efrafans go to look at her body in groups. They are frightened of the unfamiliar surroundings. They begin to hear hrududu nearby as the sun rises. The group set off north to their new home on Watership Down. It is a hard journey for rabbits not used to open countryside. After 2 or 3 days they find themselves in a copse where they dig scrapes so they can rest underground. The efrafan buck argues with the officer and rescuer bucks about staying in this place, but they all rest there for 2 nights anyway. Then, on the second morning, one of the efrafans is taken by a fox without warning. As the group flees, Hyzenthlay has to explain to the officer that the efrafan buck seems to have forgotten the advice he gave about the place, because it was the best way for a buck to get on in Efrafa. Then an efrafan-wide patrol suddenly appears, led by the best patroller in Efrafa, which causes one efrafan to nearly bolt in panic. A large buck quietly tells Thethuthinang to bring the rest of the group forward. This is enough to put the wide patrol off causing any trouble, and they leave. And then, after going a little further, they arrive at their new home, crowding into an incredibly large burrow, where the 2 leading bucks tell the whole story to those who stayed behind. The efrafans now also get to hear how their new companions got to Efrafa. Clover is pregnant. These will be the first kittens born at the new warren. The efrafans are able to dig runs and burrows freely, and Hyzenthlay and Thethuthinang tell the officer, who is clearly the chief here, how much happier this makes them. Clover and Haystack, who began their lives in a hutch, also take to digging quite well, boasting that they will bear their first litters in burrows they dug. One evening, Clover, Hyzenthlay, who is also pregnant now, and Vilthuril are with a group of bucks, one of whom tells a tale of Hlessil involving a dog. A short while after the tale is finished, Clover goes underground and gives birth to the first litter in this new warren. Then, suddenly, there is a blind panic. The efrafans have found them, and there is a large group of bucks nearby. Everyone gets underground, and holes start to be filled in. Vilthuril starts to panic and talks to Thethuthinang about what she thinks will happen now, but Hyzenthlay tells her to be quiet, pointing out that the bucks aren't panicking. She would still rather be here than having stayed in Efrafa. A small time later, a small buck has a kind of fit and makes a completely unnatural sound for a rabbit. This seems to give the chief an idea. Most of the rabbits seal themselves off in burrows at one end of the large burrow, and the large buck who got them out of Efrafa conceals himself in the floor of the run. Soon, the terrifying chief of Efrafa breaks through into the run, where there is a vicious fight between him and the concealed buck. Incredibly, another buck keeps everyone calm by telling another story while this fight is happening. And then, suddenly, it is over. The Efrafan chief is gone. Hyzenthlay tends to the injured buck who fought him. Then, after some time, the chief arrives back with an incredible tale of having ridden in hrududu. Amazed, Hyzenthlay recalls her vision in Efrafa. 6 weeks later, Vilthuril has taken the small buck as her mate. Both her and Hyzenthlay have had litters, while Clover's kittens are already in training for the Owlsa, courtesy of the buck who got the efrafans out of their old warren. Bucks and does are preparing a winter burrow further down the hill, due to the large burrow having been damaged in the fighting. And in a hollow nearby, Vilthuril tells her young kittens a tale of Hlessil. Seeing the chief, the kittens excitedly break off from the story and play with him. Then one of them senses an approaching human on a horse. Vilthuril says he has an ability for sensing such things that he has inherited from his father. She is the last doe to speak in the book. They all go underground. All is well on Watership Down. A very happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Next time, we look at the concept of Owlsa.